The night air over Berlin trembled before a single bomb touched the ground. A low drone began far off, like a distant swarm of insects, faint at first, but growing until it became an ocean of engines. Dogs barked and would not stop. Windows rattled in their frames. Loose tiles clattered from roofs. Plaster dust fell from ceilings. Mothers shook children awake and pulled them from beds, pushing them toward cellars with trembling hands. The smell of damp stone and coal dust filled narrow stairwells as families crowded together underground. And then the paradox revealed itself. Not dozens, not hundreds, but 1,000 bombers filled the sky. The capital of the Reich, once promised safety, now faced arithmetic on a scale it had never imagined. Could a city of 4 million withstand 3 million pounds of destruction dropped in one night? For years, Berlin had believed itself untouchable. In 1939, before the war widened, citizens joked that distance protected them from enemy aircraft. Britain lay nearly 600 miles to the west, and France had fallen in weeks. To the east stretched Hitler's uneasy partner, the Soviet Union. "No enemy will ever bring fire upon our capital," Hitler boasted to cheering crowds at the Sportpalast. In the first years, the promise seemed true. Between August 1940 and December 1942, Berlin endured only 30 significant raids. Casualties across those 2 years totaled fewer than 2,000 killed, a fraction of London's toll during the Blitz. Residents took pride in the contrast. They had watched London burn on newsreels, whole streets consumed by firestorms, yet their own city seemed immune. German leadership reinforced that illusion. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, repeated endlessly that Berlin was shielded by walls of firepower. By 1941, 3 massive flak towers dominated the skyline. Tiergarten, Humboldthain, and Friedrichshain. Each tower rose 40 meters, with walls of reinforced concrete 2.5 meters thick. Atop them sat batteries of 8 120-centimeter anti-aircraft guns, each able to fire a 60-pound shell up to 30,000 feet. Around them were dozens of lighter 20mm and 37mm cannons. At night, powerful searchlights mounted on the towers swept the sky, crossing beams like giant blades. The towers doubled as shelters, designed to hold 15,000 civilians. Many Berliners trusted them more than their own homes. "Our towers are fortresses," one resident wrote. "We are safe inside walls of steel." The adversary was underestimated. German leaders trusted in flak, in distance, in morale. They dismissed the possibility of massed raids as fantasy, but Britain was already thinking differently. By early 1942, under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, Bomber Command had adopted area bombing. The doctrine was blunt: send hundreds, even thousands of bombers against one city, overwhelm defenses, and crush morale by destroying both industry and housing. On May 30th, 1942, the RAF tested the idea with its first 1,000 bomber raid against Cologne. The figure itself was shocking: 1,046 aircraft in one night, dropping 1,855 tons of explosives and incendiaries. Cologne lost 600 acres of its center in hours. 45,000 people fled their homes. The glow could be seen 100 miles away. German leaders scoffed publicly. They called it a propaganda stunt. They claimed the British had emptied training schools and pulled obsolete planes into the air just to reach the figure. "They cannot repeat it," one Luftwaffe communique insisted. Goebbels wrote privately that the raid had been severe, but insisted Berlin was safe. Cologne, he said, was a medieval town of wood and narrow streets. Berlin was modern, reinforced, and vast. Behind the ridicule, unease spread. Reports reached Berlin that British factories were working day and night. In 1942 alone, Britain produced nearly 8,000 heavy bombers. The new Lancaster could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs, twice the load of earlier aircraft, and fly more than 2,000 miles. Its 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gave it the endurance to reach Berlin from East Anglia. The Halifax supplemented with smaller loads but greater numbers. Suddenly, the 1,000-plane concept looked sustainable. The United States added a new dimension. After entering the war in December 1941, American industry mobilized at a pace the world had never seen. In 1940, U.S. factories produced 6,000 planes. By 1943, they produced more than 85,000 annually, including 25,000 heavy bombers. Each month, 2,300 new B-17s and B-24s rolled off assembly lines in Seattle, San Diego, Fort Worth, and Detroit. Unlike the RAF, which specialized in night raids, the U.S. Army Air Forces believed in daylight precision strikes. Their B-17 Flying Fortress carried 4,000 pounds of bombs and bristled with 13 .50-caliber machine guns. The B-24 Liberator added even greater range. Together, they promised round-the-clock pressure, Britain by night, America by day. In Berlin, disbelief reigned. The Luftwaffe dismissed American claims. No bomber, they insisted, could fly to Berlin in daylight and survive. Their fighters would slaughter them. German intelligence also failed to grasp the scale of American escort fighter production. By 1943, the new P-51 Mustang with drop tanks could escort bombers all the way to the capital. The Reich's assumption that long-range raids were impossible was already obsolete. How does a nation measure strength in towers and promises, while its enemies measure strength in factories and output? Daily life in Berlin reflected the gap between image and reality. Blackout curtains covered windows, sandbags lined public buildings, air raid drills filled schoolyards. Families kept buckets of water in stairwells and shovels near doors. Shelters smelled of paraffin lamps, wet wool, and stale air, but complacency lingered. Theaters still sold tickets, restaurants served meals, orchestras performed in concert halls. "The Führer will not allow it," a woman wrote in October 1942. "We are his shield." January 1943 tested that confidence. On the night of the 16th, 137 RAF bombers struck Berlin. The raid damaged rail yards and power plants, killing nearly 100 people. 2 months later, in March, 162 aircraft returned. Damage was heavier. Several factories shut for days. Deaths rose into the hundreds. The raids were not Cologne, but they were warnings. A British pilot recalled, "Berlin seemed endless, a sea of lights under us. But then the flak opened up like fireworks. We knew this was the beginning, not the end." Goebbels fumed. He ordered newsreels to downplay the raids, calling them pinpricks. Yet Berlin police reports told a darker story. Fires burned uncontrolled in Moabit and Wedding. Water pressure collapsed in some districts. Thousands crammed into Tiergarten's flak tower. The heat was unbearable. Mothers fainted with children in their arms. One report recorded. Still, Goering mocked, "If a single enemy bomb falls on Berlin, you may call me Meyer," he had boasted. By 1943, the line was infamous. Bombs had fallen, and they would fall again. November 1943 brought the shattering moment. More than 440 RAF bombers struck the city in a single night. They dropped 2,000 tons of bombs. Fires raged across Charlottenburg, Moabit, and Schöneberg. The glow lit the sky for hours. Official death toll, 3,000. More than 10,000 buildings destroyed. Survivors emerged into streets where smoke hung for days, shoes sticking to molten tar. "We could not see stars, only red haze," one diarist wrote. The illusion of immunity collapsed. Berlin was no longer untouchable. The sirens began at dusk, their wail cutting through the city like a blade. At first, many Berliners ignored them. They had grown accustomed to false alarms. Families lingered at dinner tables, some finishing meals by candlelight. But then the sound shifted, urgent and insistent. Within minutes, the sky over Brandenburg Gate filled with the steady rumble of engines, hundreds of them. Searchlights swept the dark, slicing through clouds. Anti-aircraft guns in Tiergarten opened fire, their shells exploding in bursts of white against the night. And then, the bombs fell. More than 440 RAF bombers had crossed into Berlin airspace. Within hours, 2,000 tons of explosives and incendiaries rained down on Charlottenburg, Moabit, Schöneberg, and the railway yards. The sound was unlike anything heard before. The roar of collapsing buildings, the whoosh of fire racing along rooftops, the hammering thunder of falling masonry. Witnesses described the ground vibrating like an earthquake. "We thought the earth itself had split open," one survivor recalled years later. By dawn, 3,000 civilians were dead. Entire blocks lay in ashes. More than 10,000 apartments had vanished in flame. Streets were unrecognizable. Ash drifted like snow, clinging to hair and coats. The smell of burning timber, rubber, and flesh filled the air for days. Fire brigades worked without pause, but water mains had ruptured. Pumps failed. Entire districts burned unchecked. The enemy once mocked had arrived with force beyond imagination. Goebbels tried to contain panic. In a broadcast, he declared, "Berliners stand firm. The capital is unbreakable," yet his private notes betrayed fear. Ministry reports recorded tens of thousands fleeing to the countryside by train and cart. Rail schedules collapsed. Food depots closed. A confidential memorandum dated November 27th concluded, "Morale declines rapidly. Confidence in defenses is shaken. How can propaganda hold when numbers of dead defy promises of safety?" The RAF returned within weeks. Between November 1943 and March 1944, Berlin endured 16 major raids, each involved between 300 and 700 bombers. Deaths reached more than 20,000. Nearly 500,000 people were rendered homeless. Entire neighborhoods became craters. In Wedding, 5 blocks disappeared in a single night. In Kreuzberg, churches and schools collapsed with congregants and children inside. The myth of Berlin's invulnerability was gone. The raids brought horrors beyond destruction. Firestorms erupted in districts of closely packed housing. Temperatures rose so high that air itself became fuel. Winds tore through streets at hurricane force, sucking oxygen from shelters. Survivors described doors ripped from hinges and people dragged into flames by the suction. One diarist wrote in January 1944, "We lay on the cellar floor gasping. The air burned our lungs. It felt alive, as if the city itself were on fire." The sensory overload etched permanent memory. Light from flares turned night into day. Sound from engines roared without pause. 1,000 throats of steel. Heat scorched skin even in basements. The taste of ash filled mouths for weeks. At the time, Allied commanders justified area bombing as necessity. Geneva's conventions did not anticipate citywide bombardment. Officially, raids were aimed at industry and transport. In practice, half the bombs fell on housing. To commanders, this blurred line was strategy. To historians, it remains controversy. Were these strikes against production or terror itself? Daylight brought no respite. On March 6, 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched its first full-scale daylight raid on Berlin. More than 600 bombers crossed the city. For years, German commanders had insisted daylight raids were impossible. Now, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, the Americans proved otherwise. Rail depots at Tempelhof and factories in Spandau burned. German defenses shot down 69 American bombers and 11 fighters, a heavy toll, but over 500 aircraft dropped their loads. Damage crippled transport networks. The Luftwaffe lost more than 100 planes in a week. By day and by night, the enemy owned the skies. Civilians adapted to survival in ruins. Families lived permanently in bunkers. Schools relocated children to the countryside under Kinderlandverschickung programs. Diaries describe life reduced to sirens, waiting, and fear. One entry in April 1944 reads, "We no longer ask if they will come, only when. We sit in the dark and count the seconds between explosions." How does a society endure when existence itself becomes the interval between raids? Defenders strained under impossible math. Black towers fired tens of thousands of shells. On paper, they created the densest air defense in history. In practice, bomber losses rarely exceeded 5% per raid. Allied factories erased those losses in weeks. In February 1944 alone, U.S. plants delivered more than 2,200 heavy bombers. The Luftwaffe could not replace its own. Pilots climbed into cockpits knowing odds were hopeless. A veteran later said, "We flew into a wall of metal. They were always more numerous, always returning." By spring 1944, Berlin was under siege from the air. 1.5 million residents had fled. Half the city's housing was damaged or destroyed. Electricity failed for days at a time. Water was rationed. Food grew scarce. "We live in ruins." Yet the raids never stopped. One Berliner wrote in July 1944, "The shock of underestimation was complete. The capital, once promised safety, was now a city of ash, cellars, and silence." By mid-1944, the bombing of Berlin had escalated into a campaign of rhythm. The city no longer lived between seasons or weeks, but between sirens. One night, the RAF sent Lancasters. The next morning, the U.S. 8th Air Force dispatched B-17s and B-24s. The tempo was relentless, wave after wave, by day and night, until the capital became less a metropolis than a target grid. Each raid required orchestration on a scale no war had seen. A 1,000-bomber mission meant nearly 20,000 aircrew, millions of gallons of aviation fuel, and thousands of tons of bombs loaded by ground crews working through the night. Pathfinders with radar and flares flew ahead to mark targets. Radio navigation beams, codenamed Oboe and H-2S, guided formations through cloud. The result was not chaos, but machinery, a flying assembly line that delivered destruction as predictably as factories produced steel. On February 3, 1945, the U.S. launched its largest raid on Berlin. Nearly 1,000 bombers, escorted by 900 fighters, dropped 2,600 tons of explosives in daylight. Ministries, rail yards, and residential blocks vanished within hours. One witness described a single rolling detonation that lasted without pause, as if the sky itself had cracked open. The official death toll exceeded 3,000, but records note tens of thousands wounded and entire neighborhoods erased. Flak towers and Luftwaffe fighters, once symbols of security, proved irrelevant against arithmetic. Even if 50 planes fell, 950 delivered their loads. Berlin's defenses fought bitterly. The Tiergarten flak tower, armed with 8 128mm guns, fired salvo after salvo. Each shell weighed 60 pounds, traveling 30,000 feet to burst among bomber formations. In a single night, the tower could expend 10,000 shells. The thunder shook the ground as much as the bombs themselves, yet bomber losses rarely exceeded 5%. For every Lancaster or flying fortress destroyed, Allied factories produced 20 more. What is the meaning of defense when even success equals failure? The Luftwaffe's fighter force collapsed under the pressure. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Pilots often flew only a handful of sorties each week. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang with drop tanks sealed their fate. For the first time, American bombers had escorts all the way to Berlin. German pilots described their despair. The sky belonged to them. We rose into hopeless odds. Each climb felt like a death sentence. Losses mounted beyond replacement. In March 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost more than 200 fighters over Berlin in a single week. By late 1944, some squadrons could put up fewer than a dozen planes. Civilians endured consequences measured in numbers and senses. By mid-1944, half of Berlin's housing stock was damaged or destroyed. 3 million residents remained, many living in basements, shelters, or ruins patched with tarps. Electricity flickered out for days. Water mains burst under bombardment. Food distribution faltered. We line up for bread among ruins. One diary recorded, "The ash blows into our soup." The Allies perfected logistics. RAF Bomber Command flew more than 350,000 sorties against Germany during the war. The U.S. 8th Air Force added 332,000. Convoys delivered millions of barrels of fuel across the Atlantic each month. Crews drilled constantly. Dusk briefings, midnight takeoffs, long flights over the North Sea, bomb runs, return, and debrief. For Berliners, each raid felt sudden. For Allied airmen, it was routine, a job repeated night after night. At the time, commanders insisted the bombing of Berlin was a strategic necessity. Harris argued that destruction of the capital could shorten the war by a year. Geneva Conventions of 1929 contained no articles forbidding aerial bombardment of cities. The raids were officially categorized as attacks on war industry and transport. Today, historians remain divided. Were they decisive strikes that hastened the end, or acts of vengeance designed to break civilians? The ambiguity endures. Can a war waged in tons and miles ever escape moral weight? Nature itself seemed weaponized. Firestorms consumed entire districts. Heat so intense, it created winds strong enough to uproot trees and suck people into flames. Survivors described skies turned scarlet for nights on end, the taste of ash clinging to every breath. Children emerged from shelters with soot-blackened faces, coughing as if they had swallowed coal dust. Industrial imbalance drove everything. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. produced more than 96,000 heavy bombers. Britain added over 7,000 Lancasters and thousands of Halifaxes. Germany, starved of resources, built fewer than 2,000 long-range bombers in the entire war. The Reich dismantled cities for scrap. The Allies built cities of machines. By late 1944, Berlin was no longer a functioning capital. Ministries operated from cellars, trains stopped mid-journey, postal service collapsed, hospitals overflowed with wounded from both air raids and the front. A foreign observer wrote, "Berlin exists only in candlelight and fear. It is a capital in name only." Underestimation had turned to confrontation, and confrontation to systematic devastation. The city promised immunity was reduced to a shell, not by one raid but by hundreds, until destruction itself became routine. Spring 1945. Berlin was no longer a capital in the sense of government and power. It was a ruin stretched for miles, broken by the Spree, blanketed with smoke. Streets ended in piles of masonry. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Factories stood as gutted shells. Whole neighborhoods were craters filled with ash. Official reports estimated more than 45,000 civilians dead from raids between 1940 and 1945, though some German records claimed double that. At least one-third of Berlin's housing stock was destroyed outright. Another third was badly damaged. Nearly 2 million residents were displaced. From a city of 4 million, half lived as refugees, in cellars, or under tarpaulins stretched across ruins. Arrogance had ended in catastrophe. The capital, once proclaimed invulnerable, had become proof of defeat. The raids alone did not conquer Germany, but they rewired the war. Berlin was not just a symbol, but a network hub. Before the bombardment, Anhalter, Lehrter, and Schlesischer Station sent tens of thousands of soldiers and tons of supplies east and west each week. By late 1944, rail lines were crippled. Trains halted mid-journey. Repair crews patched tracks under blackout, only to see them destroyed again the next night. War production fell by nearly 40% compared to 1942. Oil was the most decisive target. Synthetic plants tied to Berlin burned repeatedly. Refineries in the suburbs poured black smoke into the sky. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe withered. Fighter wings flew a fraction of their scheduled sorties. Armored divisions at the front stalled, their tanks immobilized. A general admitted in a March 1945 report, "Air raids have rendered mobile warfare impossible. Civilians bore the heaviest cost. Families lived permanently underground. Basements became kitchens, schools, and bedrooms. Water pumps broke. Electricity vanished for days. Food distribution collapsed into chaos. Every step is through dust. Every wall is broken. We are alive, but the city is gone." One Berliner wrote in late 1944, "How long can a society endure when each morning brings only rubble?" Politically, the raids resonated far beyond Berlin. Churchill pointed to the city's destruction as evidence that Allied bombing could break German resistance. In Parliament in March 1944, he declared, "Berlin is burning. Their pride is ash. The end approaches." Goebbels countered with films showing Berliners clearing streets, insisting resilience, but his diaries told the truth. If this continues, even Berliners will lose faith. Then, commanders called bombing a necessity. Geneva Conventions of 1929 had no clauses covering aerial bombardment. At the time, raids were framed as strategic strikes against factories and transport. Yet bombs fell on housing, hospitals, and schools as often as on depots. Historians today split. Some argue the campaign shortened the war, saving lives overall. Others call it terror against civilians. The argument has never been resolved. The underestimated adversary had not only reached the Reich's heart, but hollowed it out. By late 1944, Berlin ceased to function as a working capital. Ministries worked from bunkers. Communications faltered. Black markets became survival. Refugee columns clogged streets. Civilians scavenged wood from ruins to burn for heat. One American observer wrote, "Berlin resembles a medieval siege town. The clock has gone back centuries." What does power mean when the seat of empire survives only in darkness and barter? The raids also shaped the endgame. When the Red Army crossed the Oder in January 1945, Berlin was already a wreck. Soviet artillery shattered what remained, but Allied air campaigns had laid the groundwork. When Soviet troops entered in April, they marched through streets already broken by bombs. Resistance was symbolic, not strategic. Memory etched itself in rubble. Photographs show the Reichstag as a gutted shell, the Brandenburg Gate standing amid emptiness, women clearing bricks by hand. the image of the Trümmerfrauen, Rubble women, became the symbol of post-war survival, their labor testimony to the scale of destruction. The raids had redefined war. Never before had a modern capital endured such sustained aerial siege. The 1,000-bomber raids proved cities could be destroyed from the sky without ground assault. For later generations, Berlin became the warning. If conventional aircraft could erase a city, what might atomic weapons do? What began in underestimation ended in collapse. The consequences stretched beyond 1945, shaping both memory and doctrine. May 1945. The guns fell silent, but Berlin still smoldered. Soviet artillery had finished what Allied bombers began. Journalists who entered the ruins wrote of a city that no longer resembled a capital. Streets ended in heaps of rubble. Rivers ran black with debris. Theaters, churches, ministries, each stood as a hollowed shell. "It is not a city," one correspondent observed. "It is an open grave." The capital that once dismissed Allied strength now embodied its consequences. The destruction left a dual legacy. Militarily, it validated mass bombing as a weapon of strategy. Politically, it showed the terrifying cost of industrial war. At least 45,000 Berliners were killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, millions displaced. More than 1/3 of the city's housing stock was erased. Beyond the statistics lay scars in memory. Entire generations were shaped by the experience of ruin. Strategists debated endlessly. Air power advocates claimed Berlin proved their theory. Concentrated bombing could shorten wars by crippling morale and production. Critics countered that Germany fought on until Soviet troops entered the city. It broke their bodies, not their will. One British officer wrote in 1946, "The paradox endured. Can destruction alone compel surrender, or must wars still be settled by armies on the ground?" At the time, Allied leaders argued bombing was necessity. Geneva's rules contained no restrictions on aerial bombardment. The raids were officially categorized as military strikes against rail yards, depots, and factories. Yet survivors remembered schools, hospitals, and homes reduced to ash. Historians remain divided. Some conclude Berlin's destruction saved lives by hastening surrender. Others condemn it as terror disguised as strategy. Memory shaped post-war identity. In East Berlin, ruins were displayed as evidence of fascism's collapse. In West Berlin, photographs of Trümmerfrauen, women clearing rubble brick by brick, became icons of resilience. Both narratives carried pride and pain. But under both lay the same truth. The 1,000-bomber raids had scarred Berlin permanently. Globally, the legacy was greater still. If thousands of conventional aircraft could turn a metropolis to rubble, what could a single atomic bomb do? The answer came swiftly. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Berlin's fate became the prelude to the nuclear age. Industrial war had reached its limit, and the world understood that the future would be defined by weapons even more destructive. For survivors, the memory was intimate. Diaries speak of hunger, silence, and ash. Children scavenged twisted metal, treating it as toys. Adults rebuilt brick by brick, often with bare hands. "Every stone we lifted carried the weight of memory," a Berliner recalled in 1947. The city rose again, but the shadow of fire never disappeared. The raids also redefined power itself. Armies could seize territory, tanks could break lines, but bombers could erase cities without entering them. Berlin proved that industrial capacity, not just battlefield skill, decided modern wars. The Sherman tank symbolized American ground power. The 1,000-bomber raid symbolized Allied air power. Both taught the same lesson. Logistics and production determined victory. Germany underestimated, then confronted, then collapsed. The adversary once mocked proved unstoppable, not by brilliance but by numbers, factories, and persistence. The debate did not end with the war. Was Berlin destroyed to break production or to break spirit? Was it strategy or vengeance? Each generation has asked anew, and each has answered differently. The moral uncertainty remains, echoing in every modern discussion of war from Korea to Iraq. Between 1940 and 1945, more than 68,000 tons of bombs fell on Berlin. That weight is 6 times greater than the stones used to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. The comparison is stark. A city buried not by time and sand, but by the mathematics of modern war. The 1,000-bomber raid was not only an operation, but a revelation. Pride, tradition, and faith in walls collapsed before factories, fuel, and fleets of machines. Berlin learned it in fire. The world remembered in silence.